The classroom smelled like construction paper and orange peels. 31 folding chairs, arranged in a crooked semicircle for family show-and-tell Friday. And Noah Bennett was standing near the back wall with his arms crossed the way he always stood, trying to take up as little space as a 6'2" man in a flannel shirt could take up. When his daughter Ellie walked to the front of the room, holding a paper plate glued with cotton balls, and said the sentence that would end his ordinary life as he knew it. She held the plate up like a shield, looked directly at her teacher standing by the whiteboard, and announced to 22 7-year-olds and 4 visiting parents that this was a picture of a sheep, and that sheep made her think of soft things, and soft things made her think of Miss Morgan, because Miss Morgan was the woman her dad talked about every night. The room did not go silent so much as it seemed to tilt, every head swiveling first to Ellie, then to the woman at the whiteboard, then, slowly, unbearably, to the man against the back wall, who felt the paper cup of lukewarm coffee slip out of his hand and hit the tile floor with a sound far louder than it should have been. Brown liquid, spreading across the linoleum in a shape he would later think looked exactly like the moment his whole careful, quiet life cracked open in front of strangers. Claire Morgan's pen, mid-motion toward the attendant's clipboard, stopped in the air. She looked at Ellie. She looked at Noah. And for one full second, nobody in that classroom breathed. To find out how a coffee-stained maintenance man and a first-grade teacher ended up standing in the wreckage of that sentence, and what came of it, stay until the very end. If stories like this speak to you, the quiet ones, the ones where someone gets seen for who they really are instead of who everyone assumed, we'd love to hear from you in the comments as this one unfolds, because so many of you watching have lived some version of it yourselves. And here's a question worth sitting with before we go back to where this all began. When someone we love keeps their grief to themselves for years, is that strength? Or is it simply the only kind of silence they know how to survive in? 14 months earlier, none of this existed. Noah Bennett was the maintenance technician at Bellwood Elementary, the man who fixed the flickering lights in the gymnasium and recalked the leaking sink in the teacher's lounge, and could be found most afternoons on a stepladder somewhere in the building, saying almost nothing to almost anyone, known by the staff mostly as Ellie's dad, the quiet one, always early, always gone the second the last bell rang, because he picked his daughter up himself every single day. What none of the teachers knew, what none of the parents in the pickup line knew, was that 6 years earlier, Noah had been the lead structural designer at a mid-sized architecture firm in the city. A man whose name had once been on drawings for 2 schools, a library annex, and a Riverside community center that won a regional award. A man who had built things meant to outlast him. He had walked away from all of it 11 days after his wife Rachel died. Not because anyone forced him to, not because of scandal or failure, but because he could no longer sit in a glass-walled office discussing load calculations while his daughter, then 18 months old, was being raised in fragments by a rotating cast of well-meaning relatives. He had taken the maintenance job at Bellwood because it came with an apartment 2 blocks from the school, hours that ended when the school day ended, and no one asking him to be anything other than steady. He told himself, and occasionally told Ellie in the 2 or 3 sentences he allowed himself about it, that he had traded a career for a childhood, hers, and that the trade had been worth it, and would always be worth it. And he had never once, in 6 years, said a word to anyone at Bellwood about who he used to be. Claire Morgan had been teaching first grade at Bellwood for 4 years, and she was, by every account from the front office to the parking lot, the kind of teacher parents requested by name, patient in a way that never curdled into performance, sharp enough to notice which kid hadn't eaten breakfast, and which kid was flinching at loud noises for reasons that had nothing to do with school. She had her own quiet history, a broken engagement 2 years back that she rarely mentioned, and a private rule she had built for herself afterward. One she repeated to herself the way some people repeat scripture. Don't let yourself want something you can't have without consequences. She liked Ellie Bennett enormously, the kind of bright, watchful little girl who noticed everything and forgot nothing, and she had exchanged maybe 40 words total with Ellie's father over the past year, mostly logistics, a broken window latch, a field trip permission slip, delivered by him in short, complete sentences with his eyes fixed somewhere just past her shoulder. She had noticed, the way you notice weather, that he was careful and steady and unfailingly kind to every child in that building, not only his own, and she had noticed. The way you notice something you're not supposed to be noticing. That she looked forward to the days something needed fixing. What Claire did not know, what almost no one knew, was that Noah had, for reasons he could not entirely explain to himself, developed the habit of talking to Ellie every night at bedtime, not about monsters or fairy tales, but about his day. The way some parents narrate a plot for their kids, and that over the past several months his day had begun, without his quite noticing it happening, to include Miss Morgan, how she'd handled a meltdown in the reading corner, with more patience than he thought he had left in him. How she'd noticed Ellie was tired before Ellie herself knew it. How she laughed at her own bad jokes in a way that made the whole classroom laugh with her. He said these things the way a man empties his pockets at the end of a long day, without weighing them, never imagining that his daughter was cataloging every syllable, filing it under the same category as her stuffed rabbit and her nightlight, something warm and repeated, and therefore, in a 7-year-old's logic, something true and shareable, and certainly nothing that needed to stay private. The high-stakes truth sitting underneath all of it, the thing Noah had never said aloud to a single living person, was this: he had believed, with the flat certainty of a man who has already grieved the worst thing that could happen to him, that he was finished with wanting anyone. He had built a small, sealed, functional life around exactly two priorities: Ellie's stability and his own invisibility, and he had done it successfully for 6 years without a single crack showing. That structural soundness, the thing he was proudest of quietly building, was about to be tested by 22 first graders and 1 paper plate sheep, and he had no blueprint for what came next. Because for the first time since Rachel died, something had happened that he had not designed, had not chosen, and could not simply repair with a wrench and a level head. 2 months later, on an ordinary Friday afternoon that Noah had circled on no calendar and prepared for in no way at all, that lack of preparation would collide head-on with his daughter's total inability to keep a secret, and neither he nor Claire Morgan would walk out of that classroom the same people they walked in, as, the days after, the paper plate sheep did not improve so much as calcify into a new, excruciating routine. Claire had recovered fast enough in the moment, laughing lightly and telling the class that sheep were indeed very soft, moving show and tell along with the practiced grace of someone who had once talked a boy down from eating a live hamster's food pellet on a dare. But the laugh had not reached her eyes, and Noah had seen that, and it had lodged in him like a splinter he could not stop pressing his thumb against. For the following 3 weeks he began arriving at pickup 4 minutes later than the other parents, and leaving before the crossing guard had even finished her count, rerouting himself through the north hallway to avoid passing room 114 at all, a hallway detour that added 90 extra seconds to his walk but felt, to him, like the only structurally sound decision available. He told himself this was about protecting Ellie from further embarrassment, and told himself that a second time, when the first version didn't quite hold, and did not examine too closely the third and truer reason, which was that he could not bear the particular quality of Claire Morgan's eyes on him now, no longer simply pleasant and professional, but aware, appraising, asking a question he had no intention of answering. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, at the fall conference night, in front of everyone. Bellwood ran its conferences in the gymnasium that year, tables set up in rows with a folder for each family, parents rotating through 10-minute windows while the PTA sold lukewarm coffee at a card table by the door, and Principal Adele Fisk, a brisk, well-meaning woman who ran the school like a tightly wound clock, had decided, without asking Noah, that it would be a nice gesture to have the maintenance staff introduced briefly at the start of the evening, a small thank you for the new gym floor he'd refinished over the summer. She said his name into a microphone that fed back sharply off the cinderblock walls, gestured for him to stand, and said, warmly, that Bellwood was lucky to have a man who could fix anything, and then, meaning it as a compliment, added that it was too bad he'd never gotten the chance to build anything of his own the way she understood he'd once wanted to. She did not know about the architecture firm. She was improvising, filling silence, guessing at a life she had no real information about. But the guess landed close enough to the truth that Noah felt every head in that gymnasium turn toward him at once, felt Claire's eyes find him from 2 tables away, and felt something in his chest lock up entirely. He did not correct her. He did not explain. He said a short thank you, sat back down, and spent the rest of conference night with his jaw so tight it ached the next morning. It was the next morning that things truly came apart quietly, the way real damage usually does. Ellie had overheard enough fragments from the conference night and from Noah's uncharacteristic short temper in the days after to draw her own 7-year-old conclusion, which was that she had done something terribly wrong by telling the class about Miss Morgan, and that her father was sad and it was her fault. She stopped raising her hand in class. She told Claire, in the small, honest voice kids use when they've decided to confess something, that she wasn't going to talk about her dad anymore because it made him sad, and she said it with such wounded seriousness that Claire felt something crack open in her own chest, guilt threading through it fast and unwelcome. Claire made a decision that afternoon that she would later come to see as the actual turning point of the whole story, though at the time it felt small. She asked the front office, formally, whether another teacher might be willing to take over as Ellie's point of contact for minor logistics going forward, citing, when Principal Fisk asked why, only that she wanted to avoid any appearance of favoritism given recent events. It was a professional, careful, entirely reasonable request. It was also, Claire knew even as she made it, a wall she was building specifically to keep herself from wanting something she'd already decided she couldn't have. Noah found out about the change from a form letter in Ellie's backpack 2 days later, informing him that Miss Reyes would now be the primary contact for Ellie Bennett's classroom matters, and he read it standing in his kitchen with the letter in one hand and a wrench in the other, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in 6 years, which was the specific, hollow humiliation of being quietly removed from a room without anyone bothering to explain it to his face. It was not cruelty, he understood that. It was retreat, hers, and his own retreat had caused it, and there was a strange, bitter symmetry in that he could not quite look at directly. He did not ask Claire about it. He did not ask anyone about it. He simply absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, silently, filing it under things that confirmed what he had already decided about himself, that he was better suited to fixing broken hinges than to being wanted by anyone, and that the safest, most responsible thing he could do, for Ellie's sake and for Claire's, was to disappear a little further into the walls he maintained so well. What he did not know, what he could not have known standing in that kitchen, was that Claire Morgan was doing the exact same math on the other side of town, in her own kitchen, staring at the same silence and reaching the same wrong conclusion, that neither of them wanted this, that both of them should simply let it fade. If you've ever been the one standing quietly at the back of the room while someone decided, without asking you, who you were and what you were capable of, you already know exactly how that kitchen felt, and we'd be glad to hear about it if you want to share it below, because plenty of people watching tonight have stood in that same silence. 3 months would pass, 3 ordinary, careful, distant months, before a single overheard conversation in the school supply closet would finally begin to crack the whole thing back open. The 3 months that followed settled into a kind of practiced avoidance so smooth it might have lasted the entire school year, had it not been for Marisol Reyes, the 2nd grade teacher who had inherited the paperwork nobody asked her to inherit, and who happened, on a gray Thursday afternoon in February, to be restocking construction paper in the supply closet directly beside the teacher's lounge when she overheard Claire Morgan, thinking she was alone, say something out loud that she had clearly not meant for anyone to hear. Claire had been grading spelling tests at the lounge table, and in the particular kind of unguarded moment that happens when a person believes themselves unwitnessed, she had said, mostly to herself, that she didn't know why she still thought about the maintenance man's kitchen light being on so late some nights when she walked home, and that it was a stupid thing to notice, and an even stupider thing to keep noticing. Marisol, who liked Claire enormously, and who had, unlike most of the staff, actually spoken to Noah at some length once during a plumbing emergency in her own classroom, and come away with the strong impression that he was not remotely the closed-off, purely functional man everyone assumed him to be, stood very still in that closet, holding a box of red construction paper, and made a decision to say something, later that same week, that would change the shape of everything. She did not go to Claire first. She went to Noah, on a Wednesday afternoon, while he was replacing a ballast in the hallway lights outside her classroom, and she told him, without much preamble because she was not a woman who circled things, that she thought he ought to know Claire Morgan had requested to be taken off Ellie's file not because of anything he'd done, but because she was trying to protect herself from wanting something she'd decided wasn't hers to want. Noah stood on the stepladder for a long moment without moving, screwdriver in hand, and said nothing at all, which Marisol had half expected, and then said, quietly, that he appreciated her telling him, which was the most emotionally forthcoming sentence anyone at Bellwood had heard from him in 6 years. He did not act on it immediately. That was not who he was. But something in him, some load-bearing wall he had built years ago and never once tested, had shifted half an inch, and he found himself, for the first time since Rachel died, allowing himself to actually consider a version of his life that included wanting something back. Claire's own crack came from a different direction entirely, and it arrived with far less warning. On a Friday evening a week later, she stayed late grading papers and left the building after dark, and in the parking lot she found Noah crouched beside her car with a flashlight, having noticed, on his way to his own truck, that her rear tire had gone soft and was likely to be flat by morning. He didn't say much, just that he'd noticed it and didn't want her driving home on it, and he had it swapped for the spare in 11 efficient minutes, while she stood in the cold holding the flashlight for him, watching his hands work with a precision and competence that had nothing performative about it. That was simply the truth of who he was when nobody was managing how he appeared. She asked him, almost without meaning to, where he'd learned to do that so fast, and he said briefly that he used to build things for a living, and something in the careful way he said it, the door he left open exactly 1 inch, made her ask a second question before she could stop herself. What kind of things? He told her, standing in a nearly empty parking lot under a broken streetlight he'd been meaning to report to himself for weeks, about the firm, about the schools and the library and the community center with the award, about walking away 11 days after Rachel's funeral, because Ellie needed a father who was present more than she needed a father with his name on a building. Claire did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said only that it explained a lot, and that she was sorry she hadn't known, and that she wished he'd trusted the people around him enough to say something sooner, a comment that landed harder than she meant it to, because it touched the exact nerve Noah had spent 6 years protecting, the question of whether his silence had been wisdom or simply fear wearing a responsible face. 2 weeks after the parking lot, with something unspoken but undeniably shifted between them, the secondary crisis arrived, the kind that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the fragility of the life Noah had built around one small person. Ellie came down with a fever on a Sunday night that spiked fast and hard, high enough that Noah, alone in that apartment with no family nearby and no one to call at 11 at night, drove her to the emergency room with his hands locked so tight on the steering wheel his knuckles went white, and sat in a hard plastic chair for 6 hours while doctors ran tests, watching his daughter, pale and small under fluorescent lights, and feeling for the first time in years the specific, suffocating fear that he might lose the one thing he had reorganized his entire life around protecting. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, without entirely deciding to, he texted Claire, a short message that said only that Ellie was in the hospital and that he didn't know why he was telling her. And Claire, asleep 2 miles away, woke to the message, read it twice, and was in her car within 4 minutes, arriving at the hospital not because anyone had asked her to, but because she could not imagine being anywhere else. She sat with him the rest of that night, said almost nothing, brought him bad vending machine coffee he didn't drink, and simply stayed. And it was in that hospital hallway, watching her fall asleep sitting upright in a chair beside him rather than go home, that Noah understood with total clarity that whatever wall he'd built around himself 6 years ago had a Claire-shaped door in it now, whether he'd ever intended to install one or not. Ellie recovered within 2 days, a bad flu and nothing more, but the hospital hallway had changed something between the two adults that neither of them was prepared to name yet, And Noah walked out of that building on Tuesday morning carrying a decision he had not fully made but could feel forming. That he was done, after 6 years, pretending the safest life was the only life worth having. 6 weeks would pass before that decision finally forced its way into daylight, in front of the very people who had spent years believing they already knew exactly who Noah Bennett was. The 6 weeks that followed moved differently than any stretch of time Noah could remember. Since Rachel died, quieter on the surface but restless underneath, the way water looks calm right before it finds a new channel to run through. He and Claire did not become anything so simple as a couple in that time. They became instead two careful people slowly renegotiating the terms of their own caution, meeting for coffee twice under the thin pretense of discussing Ellie's reading progress, walking the same 2 blocks home from the school more evenings than either of them could call accidental. And Noah found himself, for the first time in 6 years, sketching again, small drawings on the backs of receipts and the margins of Ellie's old worksheets, nothing anyone was meant to see, just his hands remembering what they used to know how to do. The reveal, when it came, arrived not through any confession but through necessity, in the specific, undeniable language Noah spoke best, which was competence under pressure. Bellwood Elementary's gymnasium roof, the same roof over the floor Noah had refinished the previous summer, developed a serious structural leak during a spring storm, water pooling ominously along a ceiling beam that the district's contracted engineering firm inspected 2 days later and declared potentially compromised, recommending, at a cost that made Principal Fisk visibly pale, a full 6-week closure of the gym and cafeteria wing while they brought in a structural consultant to assess the load-bearing supports, a closure that would have displaced the spring musical, the science fair, and 200 kids' lunch periods into the hallway for over a month. Noah, standing at the back of the emergency staff meeting Fisk called that Thursday afternoon, listened to the district engineer describe the problem in vague, hedging language, watched him gesture uncertainly at a beam he clearly did not fully understand, and after 11 minutes of silence finally spoke, asking one specific, technical question about the original truss specifications from when the gym was built in 1987, a question so precise and so obviously informed that the district engineer stopped mid-sentence and asked, with open surprise, how the maintenance man happened to know that. Noah told them. Not everything. Not the full 6 years of grief folded quietly into every decision he'd made, but enough. That he had been a structural designer for 9 years before coming to Bellwood. That he had reviewed enough truss failures in his career to recognize this one wasn't structural at all, but a drainage issue 2 floors up, a clogged scupper drain backing water onto a beam that was in fact sound, and that a full closure was not only unnecessary, but would cost the district money it did not have to solve a problem that could be fixed in a single afternoon with a wet vac and a new drain grate. Principal Fisk, stunned into silence for a long moment, asked him to prove it, and he did, taking 3 staff members up to the roof access that same afternoon and showing them, with the same quiet, unhurried precision he brought to every hinge and light fixture in that building, exactly where the blockage was, and exactly why the beam was fine, saving the district an estimated $41,000 and the spring musical its stage. Word moved through that building faster than anything Noah had ever seen, faster than the paper plate sheep, faster than conference night. And by Monday morning half the staff at Bellwood knew that the quiet maintenance man who fixed their sinks was, in fact, a former lead architect who had once designed award-winning buildings, and the reaction split cleanly down the line the controversy had been quietly asking all along. Some staff, mostly the younger teachers fresh out of certification programs, wondered aloud in the lounge whether it was even appropriate for someone without a current license to be making structural calls at all. Credentials mattering, rules existing for reasons. Others, older teachers and the custodial staff who'd worked alongside him for years, pointed out, with some heat, that the man had just saved the school $41,000 using knowledge no diploma could fake. And that experience earned in the field for real years mattered every bit as much as a piece of paper. More, some of them said, because paper couldn't tell you where water actually goes. Claire heard about all of it secondhand, in fragments, the way everyone did. But she also noticed something the rest of the staff didn't have context. which was Noah's discomfort with all the sudden attention. The way he seemed to physically shrink from being praised in the hallway, ducking into supply closets to avoid conversations, and she understood better than anyone in that building. This was not modesty so much as old, worn-in fear. The fear of a man who had once had his name on drawings and had learned, through loss, that visibility could cost you everything you loved. She found him that Friday afternoon in the boiler room, of all places, sitting on an overturned crate with a set of hand-sketched drawings in his lap, the ones he'd been doing on scrap paper for weeks. And when she asked what they were, he told her, haltingly, that they were nothing, just an idea for redesigning the gym drainage system properly, so this never happened again, and that he probably shouldn't have shown her. She sat down on the crate beside him, looked through the drawings, careful and precise, and clearly the work of someone who had never actually stopped being an architect, even for a single day of the 6 years he'd spent telling himself otherwise. And she told him plainly that this was the most alive she'd ever seen him look, and that she didn't understand how a man capable of this had let an entire school believe for 6 years that fixing a leaky faucet was the full extent of what he had to offer. Noah did not have a good answer for her, not one he could say out loud yet. But something about sitting in that boiler room with the drawings between them, with Claire looking at him the way she was looking at him, cracked the last piece of the wall he'd spent 6 years reinforcing, and he understood, with the same flat certainty he'd once used to convince himself he was finished wanting anyone, that he was no longer finished, and that he had run out of good reasons to keep pretending otherwise. 2 weeks later, at an assembly no one had originally planned to be about him at all, Bellwood Elementary would find out exactly how far that crack had opened, and Noah Bennett would have to decide, in front of every parent, teacher, and student in that gymnasium, whether 6 years of hiding was a habit he was finally ready to break. The assembly had been scheduled as nothing more than the district's routine end-of-year recognition night, parents filling the same gymnasium bleachers where conference night had happened months earlier. Principal Fisk running through the usual list of thank yous for volunteers and staff, and it was Fisk herself, working from notes she'd updated after the gym roof incident, who added one more name to the list, calling Noah up not as a courtesy this time, but as a genuine, informed thank you, explaining to the full room accurately now that Mr. Bennett had spent 9 years as a structural designer before joining Bellwood's staff, that his award-winning work included 2 schools and a community center, and that his quiet expertise had just saved the district tens of thousands of dollars it did not have. This time there was no coffee cup to drop, no room tilting sideways, only Noah standing at the front of a full gymnasium while people who had walked past him for 6 years, without truly seeing him, applauded. Some of them, the younger staff who'd questioned his authority weeks earlier, applauding loudest of all, having quietly come around, in the way people often do, once the proof was undeniable in front of them. It was Ellie who made the moment mean something more than professional recognition, standing up from her seat in the second row without asking anyone's permission, the same way she had months earlier, and announcing to the room that her dad had also drawn a whole new roof for the gym so it would never leak again, and that Miss Morgan had helped him believe he was allowed to show people. And the room laughed, warmly this time, no cruelty in it anywhere. And Claire, standing near the exit doors, felt her face go warm and did not look away when Noah found her eyes across the gymnasium, both of them understanding, without a word passing between them, that the secret Ellie had accidentally exposed months earlier in a first-grade classroom was no longer a secret either of them wanted kept. Restoration came in 2 forms over the following weeks, one showy and one quiet, and Noah, true to who he had always been, chose the quiet one without hesitation. The district, embarrassed by how long a credentialed structural professional had gone unrecognized on their custodial payroll, offered him a newly created facilities director position with a significant raise and his name on a plaque in the front office, and Noah turned down the plaque entirely, accepting only enough of a title change to formally lead a small maintenance and capital planning team, on the condition that the district create a standing fund, seeded partly from the money his gym repair had saved them, to catch small structural problems in aging school buildings before they became expensive emergencies, a systemic, unglamorous request that would help buildings and kids he'd never meet, which was, everyone who knew him agreed, exactly the kind of thing he would ask for. The quiet coda arrived 4 months later, on an ordinary Saturday in early autumn. In the small backyard behind the house, Noah and Ellie had moved into that summer, a house with room enough, finally, for the drafting table he'd bought himself as a private, hesitant kind of gift. Claire sat on the back steps watching Ellie chase a wobbling soccer ball across the Everest, and Noah came out from the garage carrying 2 mismatched mugs of coffee, handing her one and sitting down beside her without a word, the two of them watching his daughter in comfortable, ordinary silence for a long moment before Claire finally asked him what he thought real worth actually meant. After everything, Noah considered the question the way he considered everything, slowly, and said that he used to think it meant being the man whose name was on the drawings, and that for 6 years afterward he'd thought it meant disappearing so completely that nothing could ever be taken from him again, and that it had taken a paper-plate sheep and one very honest 7-year-old to teach him it actually just meant being fully present for the people who loved him, visible and all, nothing hidden, nothing braced against loss in advance. Claire didn't say anything back right away. She just leaned her shoulder against his, watched Ellie do a small, triumphant victory lap around the yard for absolutely no reason at all, and let the quiet between them say the rest. If there's someone in your own life who spent years being quietly underestimated, someone who kept their real story tucked away because it felt safer that way, until somebody finally noticed what they were actually carrying, we'd love for you to tell us about them in the comments, even if it's just to finally give them the credit they never got to hear out loud. Has a child in your life ever said something wildly, embarrassingly honest that ended up being exactly the truth the adults around them were too careful to say themselves? We think stories like Noah's, the quiet, overlooked ones who turn out to be carrying more than anybody realized, deserve to be seen, and if you believe that too, we'd be honored to have you stay part of this story with us, subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Because somewhere, right now, there is a person just like Noah Bennett, steady and unassuming, and carrying something remarkable nobody has bothered to ask about, and it may only take one small, honest voice, a child's or your own, to finally let them be truly seen. Thank you for staying until the very end.